We'll get started because this is a very popular and timely subject, resilient fundraising in uncertain times. So we're really glad to have you here doing this today. I'm Yvonne Sims. I'm the Educational Programming Manager, and I'm sitting in Atlanta, Georgia. So hello to all the folks all over. If you don't know Candid already, we're thinking you do because you're here, but maybe not. Candid is the coming together of Foundation Center and Guide Star. And every year, millions of nonprofits spend trillions of dollars, and we kind of find out where that money goes, where it comes from, who it's going to. And obviously, during this time, it's been interesting to have that information as well. So you may see on our site where we're talking about what's happening with funding and what are some of the ways that things are changing and what can be mitigated. We also have trainings like obviously the one today, and we have tools like Foundation Directory and our Candid profiles, and those can be accessed through our partners. We have over 1,800, I think, at this point, partners throughout the country and in Mexico. And they're mostly libraries where you can access our tools for free. And then we also have some United Ways, some nonprofit resource centers, some universities. But that is one way that you can access our tools for free. And we know that's really important right now. All right, I'm excited about this. So we have Kia Kroom today, and besides having like the fly headshot, we're gonna let her introduce herself and just tell you more about what she does, and then she'll share her presentation. Kia was nice enough to say, questions kind of throughout. We're gonna vibe this out. So I'll let you start and turn it over to you, Kia.
Hi, how's everybody out there? I hear it's a lot of folks on the line, y'all, and I'm so excited. I'm glad you're here. Um, I like to interact with folks. Y'all can ask questions. This is y'all show. I'm here and I hope that what I have to share with you resonates. But I'm here as a fundraiser. I'm the CEO of Kia Kroom Fundraising and Philanthropy. I am a 25-year nonprofit fundraiser. My claim to fame is having raised $1 billion for nonprofits, primarily social justice organizations, human service organizations, you name it, over the last 25 years. I am a nonprofit founder and a fractional fundraiser. I work with organizations like yours all across the globe. And this work fills me. And what I want you to know about me is that I'm here not just as a practitioner or subject matter expert. I'm here as a person. I'm a real person, and I know that there are real people on this line that if you're like me, sometimes this work feels deeply, deeply personal. If you're like me and you are proximate to the communities or people your organizations are serving, you're close to the pain, you see people going through stuff, it's some tough stuff out here going on. So I'm here as not just a practitioner, a colleague. I'm here as a real person wanting to relate with other real people. I see y'all are repping from all over the place. I didn't see Oakland on here. If Oakland's on here, Oakland stand up. Oakland stand up. We know that I rep my city where I grew up. However, I'm in the DC, Northern Virginia area, but I see folks on here from all kinds of places. Hey, Oakland, stand up. Iman, I see you, mama. All right. So,
They're usually here too. They're in here.
Oakland, stand up all day, right? Now, I'm going to tell you hey, I see DC. DC, stand up. Bay Area, stand up. Yes. Now, I'm going to tell you just a little bit about why this is so important to me. I think that resilient fundraising is the only way to go, right? And when I say resilient, I'm meaning resilient and durable over time. And that's how we have to be in these uncertain and crazy times. I'm ready to dive right in. But like I said, you can interact with me. I have the chat up. Let me ask you something really quick, Yvonne, before you go. Are people limited to asking in the Q&A? Is that where we want people to?
Yeah,
Because I
we
break
want
bread sometimes and ask in the chat. What do we want the good
Yeah,
people out
we
there to
want them
do?
to ask questions in the Q&A just because
Okay,
we're so big, and then they
right.
can make comments in the chat. But I got you on the Q&A.
Okay,
So if you
okay,
feel like you're
okay.
looking at chat, I'll look at the Q&A.
Okay, okay. So with that being said, y'all heard it from the lady, the good lady here, Yvonne. You want to put your questions in the Q&A. I've got my chat going. If it's not too distracting to me, if you drop me a line or something, I'll shout back at you. You talk to me, I'll talk back. Um, we can get in. Let's get into it. Let's get into it. Am I able to share?
Yep.
All right, let's get into it. All right, so you all know this lovely lady here. I'm not going to hang out too long here. I want to give you just a sneak peek at what we're going to discuss. Resilient fundraising. There's levels. There's levels to this. I'm going to talk to you about resilient fundraising, number one, on a personal level, right? Looking at ourselves, looking at the fundraiser, right? Looking at the leader. I understand there are people on this webinar who work in a variety of capacities, right? um, I want to talk about the person, the whole person, right? And we're going to also talk about what resilient fundraising requires on an organizational level. Okay, we're going to look at some data points, some donor behavior, courtesy of the Fundraising Effectiveness Project. That's a report, excuse me, that's a report that I followed for a good while throughout my career. We're going to look at some data points that point to more or less donor behavior, because while there's so much going on, lots of things happening with these executive orders and different decisions are being made. And it feels like the wackiest time ever if you work in this space, if you're in the nonprofit sector, the philanthropy sector. But I want to remind you, we've seen this playbook before. We have, right? And we got through it. And I've got some data points and receipts that will help us to kind of ground in terms of, how we navigated in the past in this moment and as we're looking ahead, right? And we'll have an opportunity for reflections, because I want reflections from you all, right? You can limit your reflections to the chat. And of course, we'll get into some Q&A, and I want to make sure to leave some time for Q&A, right? Because ultimately, the star of this show is you, and I want to hear from you. Wanted to talk about my why, our why, right? When we think about why it's so important that we look at how we're building resilience within our fundraising strategies and tactics in this season, in this time, right? It's very, very clear that philanthropy is under attack. I'm just going to say it. You can agree with me, you can disagree. This is how I see it. And I'm going to be very, very just direct. Philanthropy is under attack right now, and solutions have to include frontline communities, people of color, BIPOC communities. This cannot be addressed, it cannot be solved without the voices of those communities at the forefront. This cannot be solved, remediated, addressed without input and buy-in on the ground from the people that are most proximate to the pain. Let's make no mistake about it. I don't care if you have a PhD or a GED. We're in this together, but the people that are closest to the harm, historically minoritized racial and social groups, have to be a part of our pointed strategy and response, right? Number one. Number two, my why, our why. Mission driven workers need support. I shared with you in the beginning, I'm a real person. I take things personally, just like you do sometimes. And try as I might, to decouple my feelings from the work. I've been trying to do that for almost 30 years as a fundraiser, and I've not necessarily been successful because this work that I'm doing, I don't know about anybody else, is really an extension of my lived experience with structural inequity, with poverty, with educational inequity, and I could go on the whole list of inequities, but that is why I'm here and that is why I do what I do, right? And what I'm learning as the days get longer, some days, as the weight feels heavy, is that I need support, right? And that I need community and that I need to make sure that I am grounded and that I am rooted and that I am strategic. And if you're like me, you feel me and you understand where I'm coming from. So, mission driven leaders need support, workers, not just leaders. Whether you're, entry level or in the C suite and you're in a mission driven organization, you want to feel supported, especially now during these times, which I've not quite seen as much panic and fear and just chaos since the pandemic. It's given the pandemic, some of what we've seen as of late, right? And we need support, right? Third, why? Third point, funding cutbacks require innovation, right? We've got to be measured, strategic, and we may have to look at reimagining how we're going about our fundraising, right? We may have to do things that we'd not necessarily consider in order to sustain and withstand for the long haul. So that's our why. Enter the poll. We've got an interesting poll for you all.
Yeah, so our first question is, has your organization been impacted by the following? And it's federal funding disruptions, recent funding shifts that decenter equity. We should have probably put or all of the above because it may be the same, but it might be that it's separate. So right now, people are answering very quickly. Thank you. I'm gonna wait till we get about 70% or so. But can you see that, Kia? They can't see
I
it
can
yet,
see
but can you
it.
see?
I can't
Okay.
see any data, but I can see the question.
Yeah, okay. So I'll share in a second. So what it's saying so far, because we have about 60%, is that 60% are federal funding are having federal funding disruptions, and about 40% have recent funding shifts that decenter equity. So that's kind of where we
Mm,
are. I'm
yeah.
gonna go ahead. All right. I'm gonna
And I'm hearing
end.
and I'm seeing people react in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
Folks were saying, yeah, both. Some were saying
Yeah.
neither. Oh,
Oh,
wow.
okay. Okay. And then you wanted me to ask the second question. I'm gonna
Yes.
head and launch the second question. Oh, hold on. First, I gotta stop sharing this one. Okay, there you go. All right, we're launching the second poll, and this one is about self-care because if we're doing this work, as Kia mentioned, we need support and we need to help ourselves as well. It says, how often do you prioritize your own self-care while doing mission-driven work? And the options are always, that'd be amazing, often, sometimes, rarely, or never. And we're at 60% already. I'll let it go a little bit longer and then I'll share. But so far, sometimes is leading, which is not so bad. I think we're doing
That's
pretty
okay.
good.
We're being frank and honest. This is a safe
Yeah,
space.
and I think we what I like about this question is I just had a similar question in a group chat with my sorority sisters, and everyone knows the right answers. like we know what we should be doing, but what are you
Right,
actually doing? And
right.
that's kind of different. So I'm gonna go ahead and end. We're at 75%. I'm gonna share the results. And as you can see, sometimes 48% is the highest, always had 4%, often 21%. We got to hear from those folks. Rarely 24%. I'm glad that's a little lower than I expected, and never 3%. We got to do better than that. So I'm gonna stop
We
sharing
go,
them.
we gonna talk about it. We gonna talk
Okay.
about it.
Okay.
So I fall in that often category. I'm not even in always, and I'm pretty diligent. So shout out to those always folks. Shout out to the sometimes folks. You trying, right? I see you out there. I feel you.
And and I'm just gonna say, because Laura's asking, and it makes sense to ask right now, what does self-care mean in this poll?
Ah, good question. So self care can mean whatever you want it to mean, right? Self care, by definition, keyest definition, right, is intentionally caring and nurturing self, right? I'm listening to a sound bath right now. You can't hear it, but I'm listening to a sound bath in the background. Sound baths help me when I'm feeling a little anxious. I was feeling a little anxious coming in here, and just to kind of bring me down, listening to that sound bath helps, right? Getting a good nap, right? It could be going to the spa for people that have those means. Some of us don't always have the means to do that, right? I'm real good to bring the spa right into my bedroom, right into my living room, wherever I want to, do it, right into I'm fortunate to have a sauna in my house. Self-care for me is sitting in the sauna for 15 minutes, 30 minutes if I'm feeling, if I have the benefit of that time, right? But it's deliberately carving out time to nourish and replenish and care for self. It's being deliberate about keeping a pulse on how I'm feeling, how I'm responding, right? And being mindful of when I'm feeling triggered, right? When I'm feeling anxious. I've managed generalized anxiety, was diagnosed, late in my career, right? I'll get into that in a moment, get a little personal, but does that help, Lauren? I think it was you said, Lauren, who asked that question, but we're going to get into it. Thank you all for indulging me in that poll. Thank you very much. So let's talk about resilient fundraising and what that requires on a personal level, because remember, so often we talk about this work and we talk about the work of the organizations or the work of the development function or the development department. Very seldom in 25 years have I heard very many conversations about the person, about the people behind the machine. And I want to take a moment and talk about that. Can we get personal, y'all? Can we get personal? Show me some reactions. I want to get a little bit personal with you all because I'm a real person at the end of the day, right? I want us to have a little bit of fun. And I like to put the fun in fundraising. I'm not with all that stuffy, stuck up stuff. Folks is going through stuff. People have lost jobs, incomes. We gotta have a moment, y'all. So I'm gonna get a little bit personal. Um, as I shared, I was diagnosed with generalized anxiety late in my career. And with that, I thought to myself, looking back over my life and looking back over the work that I've been so blessed and privileged to do, I realized that I had spent most of my time in a survival orientation, most of my career in a survival orientation. I'm very public about the fact that I'm a single parent. I have an adopted child in addition to, my son, who a lot of people, if you follow me, you see him. I'm a proud mama. I'm always posting about, my son and his accomplishments. Both of my kids are going into their junior year of college. And something happened when I was diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder. I had this reckoning that I had been in this survival orientation. And I want to talk to you about the dangers of that survival orientation. if this might be you and you're aware of this, or if this might be you and you're not aware of it, right? It's never being able to be present in the moment that we are in, right? And always trying to get to the next juncture, to the next job, to the next role, to the next relationship, to the next friend, to the next this, to the next that, right? What I realized is that I was missing moments, right? Because I was always looking in the future and trying to figure out how I'm going to survive as a result of my lived in experiences with poverty, with generational poverty, right? And I began to do this healing work and look at, how do we put Kia back together, right? I've had a fabulous career, right? But what is a fabulous career if Kia is not well and measured? And how long will I be able to enjoy such a fabulous career if I am not well, right? And that's when things change for me, right? Resilient fundraising on a personal level requires us to do a couple of things. It requires us to really, really, really be heavy on the self care, as the young folks say, right? Heavy on the self care, right? I want to be really, really clear. The times that we are operating in, I don't care if you're on a board, I don't care if you are a CEO, if you're a director, who you might be, entry level worker. I'm speaking to everybody. This is not business as usual. And we cannot behave as though it is, right? I know that we work in offices and some organizations are more grassroots, some are more corporate. But if we make the mistake and try to function as though it's just business as usual, we're going to lose some folks, right? And good folks. We're going to lose some good folks, right? So we have to be diligent about taking care of ourselves, right? Prioritizing self-care. And what I'd like for everyone on here to do who's thinking about how they can personally be more resilient is, what can you do on a regular basis, whatever cadence feels good to you and comfortable for you, right? To establish a regular self-care ritual or routine. I get up and go on my front porch in the morning and have a cup of tea. That's how I like to start my morning. I'm an apothecary owner. I'm a plug at 22 Apothecary and Tea Room, www.apothecary.com. That is my passion project. It's an apothecary and tea room, and I make my brew of one of my teas and have it on my porch, bonnet on, robe on, the whole nine. I don't care. I sit out there. I might meditate on scripture or make my prayers. I write notes. That's how I start my day, right? And that is a regular routine. I want to encourage you, if you're looking to be more resilient on a personal level, be gentle on your mental. What do I mean by that? To be mindful of what sort of stimuli is triggering to you. For me right now, you will never walk in my home and hear the news playing, right? Sonically, I can't take it. It's too much for me. Headline after headline, seeing horns, hearing a sonically, I cannot take it. And I decided that I don't have to. And I've liberated myself from that. And you can do that as well. I've made a conscious decision to get my news in other places. I get my news online, as opposed to listening to the news all day. I had to give that battle up, right? Because I found that it was making me anxious. I found that it was making me upset. I was a different person, right? So that's my example, is figuring out what is stressful stimuli, right? What's causing you the stress? It could be a phone call from somebody that you don't want to talk to. It could be that friend, that loved one that's always calling you and leaning on you and dumping on you. You are not a trash can, and neither am I. So part of that being gentle on my mental is choosing not to have certain conversations with folks, right? Because I can't take it. It's just not good for my mental health. And people close to me hear me say that periodically. You know what? I can't do that. That's just not going to be good for me, right? Or that's not going to be good for my mental health. That's how vigilant I'm being about my self care. Now, another part of being resilient when we're talking about the person here is boundary setting. And I'm encouraging everyone out there, from the person that answers the phone to the CEO to the board directors, board governors that might be on here. Everybody has bandwidth, and everybody defines their bandwidth differently. But I'm challenging you, those of you who really want to grab this resilience thing by the horns personally, to honor your bandwidth and be mindful of your bandwidth. When you're thinking about, when you're clarifying deadlines at work, when you're on those Teams meetings or those Zoom meetings and folks are saying, okay, when can we get this accomplished by? When can you turn this around? Be mindful of your bandwidth, right? Because this is not normal business. There are decisions being made that are impacting our work, that are impacting our constituents, and we're carrying that. Some of us are carrying it in our hearts, some of us are carrying it in our womb, and we somaticize things in our body. And I don't want to limit honoring bandwidth to work, right? Outside of work. I'm going to be honest with you. I'm at that certain age where I don't just jump and commit to doing stuff anymore. You call me on a Tuesday or a Monday saying, hey, are you going to be able to come to that? I'm saying, oh, let me see how I feel. Can I let you know by Thursday or Friday? I'm honoring my bandwidth, right? And giving myself room. I see people laughing. I'm being so honest. And there are people that I've had to call on Thursday or Friday and say, I'm not going to be able to do it. Thought I was going to be able to do it, not going to be able to do it. Can I send you a Cash App or a Zelle, a love gift? But I'm not going to be able to do it. The week got to me, what have you, right? Now, I'm asking you to honor your bandwidth, not to be the clog in the log jam, right? Because people are trying to make you feel like you're clogging the log jam and people's eyes may roll, because we don't move in a society where this is encouraged. I was never taught as a little girl to honor my bandwidth and to set boundaries. It had been modeled to me to always be selfless and always pour, and do, right? And to always succumb to groupthink or popular opinion. This is a radical self-act for me. And now that I know this, I'm operationalizing it to set myself up for success. I'm very aware that in order for me to show up the way you want me to show up, if you're working with me, if I'm working with you, that I have to honor my bandwidth so that I can show up in my best light, right? So often throughout my career, I made it a practice to work inside the strategy and not so much allowing myself time to work on the strategy. We have to work on the strategy as well as in the strategy, right? And when we don't honor our bandwidth, we lose some of our autonomy in terms of how we show up, right? I want to make sure that I'm always showing up in my power and at my best. And honoring my bandwidth allows me to do that, right? And sometimes that means saying no. It's a complete sentence, right? This is especially true for fixers, empaths, and pourers. If you are an empath, my heart goes out to you. I'm an empath to my core. And one thing you've got to know, if you work with empaths, right? Or you have empaths in your household or in your, cipher, your space, we feel things, right? So those headlines that one person might hear and be able to drop it off real quick, that's not necessarily the case for empaths. Some of us lose sleep at night over the things that we hear and see. Some of us cry real tears, and feel pain. So we've got to honor our bandwidth through boundary setting. I want to stop and check in. How is this landing with you all before we move into the organizational level? How's it landing? Show me reactions. We're talking about the person, something we don't talk about when we're normally talking about this work. And I see the hearts and thumbs up, which means to me, this is landing well, right? We've got to put people at the center of this. We are real people doing real work that moves communities. Now, let's get into resilient fundraising on an organizational level. I've given you a definition, right? Not going to insult you by reading it, but what I am going to say is that resilient fundraising equips us to adapt, sustain, and thrive amid challenges, right? And again, it's going to cost us something. It's going to cost us in that we've got to be willing to do things that we may not have necessarily done, right? We've got to be willing to reimagine or innovate, and we've got to keep community at the center of that, right? I'm going to continue. Here's a little context. I told you I had a few data points to share for you because I want to ground us in some data points. I remember the first Trump administration. At that time, I was working for a national children's organization, and I remember some of the things that were taking place and the implications that it posed for children, right? I remember watching how donors and donor prospects were seeing the same things that we were seeing, that I was seeing in the headlines. And I remember how they responded to those things with their giving, right? When migrant children were being separated from their parents, I remember how dark that moment felt. And I remember how donors and donor, institutional partners at that time responded through their giving, right? Now, according to the Fundraising Effectiveness Project, when I looked at the data points over from the report, my team and I looked at, let me explain, my team and I looked at the Fundraising Effectiveness Project's reports during the lion's share of the Trump administration's, their first merry-go-round, right, in the White House, right? And here's what we saw, right? And you see it, you're seeing it here just as I'm seeing it with here. When we look at growth and giving, right, we saw a slight dip in 2017 to about 2%, but 2018, it was up. As the young people say, it was up, right? There was a growth in giving. Now, the composition of the Fundraising Effectiveness Project report changed a little bit. So once I go through the next couple of slides, I'll share findings from their 2020 report. The composition shifted and some of the things that the report was tracking from year to year, and even the frequency in which they were capturing data, it kind of shifted. But nonetheless, I'll give you a short briefing on that. When we looked at donor retention, it was pretty consistent, right? About 45%, at least the first couple of years. We saw a little dip in 2018. We saw that to be pretty consistent through 2019, but it was pretty consistent. It was an ebb and flow, but it was pretty consistent, right? During that first Trump 1.0 administration. Now, In terms of growth in donors, right? We saw some volatility. We saw we were at 6% and 16, which was year one. We saw a little spike. 2017, ooh, we saw a dip. We saw a dip. We saw that dip in 2018 to 2.8%, where we saw fewer new donors coming to the table with gifts. But interestingly enough, what we saw was those stalwart, loyal donors made up the difference with their giving, right? While there was attrition with new to file donors, right? And we're talking individual donors. While there was attrition with new to file donors, those stalwart donors were pretty consistent and made up the difference. And then we saw that it was up in 2019, right? Looks like about 7 or maybe slightly higher than the 7, approaching 8% in growth in donors in 2019, right? And my recollection and my experience was the same was true with institutional donors. It was those stalwart donors that we really leaned on. It was maybe those new to file and more transactional donors that were a little wobbly, a little wishy-washy, as my grandmama would say, who's from the South, a little shaky, right? But those stalwart institutional partners made up the difference, right? In terms of gift retention rate, right? People giving at the same levels, roughly, people giving in the same neighborhood that they had previously given, right? Or making repeat gifts, right? We saw some encouraging results, right? We saw a slight drop in 18. As I shared with you, the data sets changed for 2020. So I shared with you what I have. I don't know what the verdict was on that for the 2019. I'll jump to 20 and share with you what I have in front of me. Let me go back. When I looked at findings from the 2020 report, we saw that the measures were overall giving and donor growth. We saw an increase of 10.6%, which is really, really encouraging, right? Meaning, folks were giving and the donor pool grew compared to 2019, right? By 10.6%. So more people were giving, right? We did see some attrition in the number of donors, right? They said that, this is a little confusing to me now that I look at it. They're saying the number of donors grew by 7.3% year over year. Okay, the number of donors grew by 7.3%. Okay, we'll take that. That's encouraging, right? In terms of donor retention, there was a 4.1% decrease from 2019. So in the 2020 report, we were back to hovering around 43.6% in terms of donor retention. But again, that's not news to us, right? We were hanging out in that territory. In terms of, here's a new data point that was being tracked in the 2020 report that I don't believe had been previously tracked, and that was donor acquisition and recapture. According to the 2020 report, new donors increased by 18.5%, right? New donors increased, so that means we had more new to file folks. But check this out. There was a recapture of lapsed donors, people who had previously given, right, were recaptured by 13.7%. So in 2020's report, which looks at 2019 data, I can tell you that where I was working, we were utilizing targeted strategies to recapture lapsed donors, and we saw encouraging results. And it sounds like we were in good company with 13.7% of donors recapturing of lapsed donors, right? The last data point I want to share with you is giving by donation size. We saw a 15.3% increase in small donations that are $250 or less, right? Those are what we call, in a lot of cases, in a lot of organizations, regular donor gifts, right? Gifts $250 or less. There was an uptick in that, according to the 2020 report. We saw an increase in mid-level giving, gifts ranging from $250 to $999, just under $1,000. We saw that group increase by 8%. Now, are you ready for the major donor donations? Drum roll. We saw major donor contributions of $1,000 or more increase by 10.4%. We've seen this before, right? And if we look back in the spirit of Sankofa, we're equipped to move forward, right? We've seen this playbook before. We were resilient about it then, as were our donors, our stalwart people, and we're going to continue to be resilient. So keep calm and carry on, right? Keep calm and carry on. Now, resilient fundraising on an organizational level requires a few things from us. Let's take a look at what that requires. It requires an organizational culture that is rooted in honesty and transparency, and I would add vulnerability. I would add empathy. This has to be modeled from the board of directors down the C-suite on down, right? And I've seen this model very, very well with, CEOs that demonstrate empathy, that demonstrate transparency, that keeping folks in the loop of, difficult decisions, whether it's a funding cut, whether it's cuts to, payroll cuts, whatever the case may be. I remember being in market and working in organizations, and I didn't like surprises, and neither did my colleagues, right? Especially when it pertained to the work that we're doing that we loved, right? And the impact that we were making in society, right? So on an organizational level, resilient fundraiser requires that vulnerability and that empathy. It requires within the organization, it requires us to create opportunities for shared humanity, right? It could be that small talk before we get into the meat and the heart of the meeting, right? Those moments in the staff meeting, where we check in with folks and we want to know how folks are doing. Those moments in which we honor and celebrate folks that are going above and beyond and doing their part in the organization to serve our constituents or even to lift morale because we're in some difficult times, right? This is an organizational construct, and an organization cannot and will not be resilient and withstand absent this. I've seen this model and I've seen how it resonates with folks, right? And I've seen how it lands with folks, right? When folks feel as though they're a part of an organization that models these behaviors, it makes all the difference. Resilient fundraising requires us to prioritize sustainability. Scalability might not be the strategy right now, right? It might be a situation within your organization where it's really about sustaining the work, right? I can tell you, talking with some leaders last year, talking with some leaders last week, preparing for a donor call. The ask on the table was, okay, we want to ask for, let's say, $250,000, right? Is that $250,000 that we're requesting from one of our institutional partners? Are we proposing to do more with that funding? Or are we proposing to sustain the work that we're doing with our constituents and possibly even deepen that work, sometimes it's not about doing more, right? Or serving more or getting more people in the seats. It's about more practically serving the constituents that we have. And it requires us to have honest conversations with funders and say, listen, you know, maybe that funder wants you to scale. I understand X corporation or X foundation, you'd like to see us serve more people. The fact of the matter is that the folks that are presenting, or the communities or the organizations that are presenting, have very, very complex needs that we don't want to overextend ourselves and make it a priority to serve more. We want to more effectively serve the people that we're in community with and serving, right? And we feel that your dollars would serve us very well to do that instead of adding more people to our constituent portfolio, et cetera, right? It's through these kinds of conversations that we're able to deepen relationships with our institutional partners, whether they're corporations, and even individuals, right? You might have a high net worth donor who needs to know this, that right now serving more constituents could put us in a precarious situation. We want to more effectively serve folks, right? And we want to utilize your funding and your partnership and to do this as we see you as being part of this solution, right? And that's where that deeper engagement and deeper relationships happens, right? Resilient fundraising on an organizational level requires us to level set. It requires us to be honest, right? In terms of what we're looking at. Like what I just modeled for you is an honest conversation, right? I've been in environments where my leaders, my colleagues were really paralyzed with fear. Except me. I don't know what it is about me that I've never been afraid to speak truth to power, that I've never been afraid to tell the truth. But I've worked in environments where people were really fearful and had difficulty and churn about doing this. But this is a very important element of resilient fundraising. We got to get honest, right? It requires us to level set expectations of our board of directors. No, we might not, we aren't, it's not healthy for us to set a goal to double revenue in this fiscal year. Let me tell you why, right? If we set an imperative to double revenue in this fiscal year, it's not tenable, right? But if we set a goal to double revenue over the next 2 to 3 years, yeah, that's tenable. And here's the strategy in which we can get that accomplished. Let's create a 3-year growth and optimization strategy. But I'm sorry to, be if I'm being the bearer of bad news, but setting the revenue goal at that target, unless you know something that I don't, unless you know about a big gift that's getting ready to come in that I don't from one of your cronies or friends or buddies, board member, I don't know that that's the best approach to take, right? It requires that level of transparency from the fundraising team, from the CEO to board members to colleagues to donors and partners. It requires honest conversations. I see some of y'all laughing. Am I lying? I'm being honest. Sometimes we have to level set folks in terms of what we can reasonably accomplish, and that is cardinal to resilient fundraising on an organizational level. Resilient fundraising requires us to systematize stewardship. You saw in those data points that I shared with you that the real consistency was among those repeat donors, right? Those loyal donors who made up the difference year over year when we saw attrition with new to file donors, right? In order for us to effectively steward our donors, we got to systematize things, right? Set up those policies and those automations so that I don't have to stop what I'm doing to ensure that when a donor makes a gift, whether it's a tribute gift, right? Or whether it's a one-time gift, right? That automation is in place such that the donor automatically, within that 48 hours, 72 hours, gets that thoughtful donor acknowledgement letter, right? We have to systematize those stewardship reports, those impact reports, and make sure that as an organization, as a unit, right, that folks are getting that annual impact report like clockwork, right? That this is embedded into our fundraising strategy, right? That those routine check ins with our institutional donors, with our individual donors, particularly those major donors, and I would even say some high potential mid level donors, right, are getting those touches periodically that keep them connected to our organization and our mission, right? That keep them tied to the work, that convey to them the impact that their funding is having on the work that we're doing, right? And that may require us to consider some novel approaches. I was talking with one of my co conspirator agencies. I don't call people that work with me clients. You're not clients, you're co conspirators. Okay. And I was talking with one of my co conspirator organizations, and we decided that a meaningful touch point for this particular organization would be an opportunity to have virtual coffee once a year with their CEO. In this organization's case, the CEO had come in, he was relatively, I want to say he was relatively new. He'd been in the role for maybe 9 months. There wasn't really any announcement that he had come into the organization. So we wanted to create an environment where folks got to know more about him and the opportunity to talk to him and hear from him, especially given the DEI laden nature of the work that the organization were doing. And this was a few months back when, the woke wars really, really turned up, right? We knew that people wanted to hear from him and hear how some of these things were impacting the organization. So we thought that that was a meaningful way to steward folks, to allow folks to get some face time and some down booting and to hear from him, right? Something novel, hadn't been done before. Whatever you decide to do, let it be meaningful and systematize it so that you're stewarding those donors that you have, because the old adage goes, it costs less money to keep them than it does for new donor acquisitions, right? Let's continue because I want to hear from you all. Keeping in this theme, right, resilient fundraising on an organizational level requires us to prioritize retention. I just talked about stewardship. The same is true for retention. And the way that we keep folks retained, where we see those donor retention rates maintain stably and increase, is when we segment, right? When we're speaking to major donors who are contributing specific amounts and we're speaking to them as a group. We might speak to them a little bit differently, or we should be speaking to them differently than we're speaking to our monthly donors, right? We want our monthly donors to get a certain message. So we segment those messages, right? I've worked in environments where everybody was bucketed in and everybody got the same message, and it did not always land, right? My experience has been, and donor, the reports and the data points show that that is a major tenet of donor retention, right? Is segmentation. And now, with all the wonderful tools we have, the benefit of automation. I'm going to blow through the next couple of slides because I want to hear from you all. I know that you've spent a good bit of time with me, and I'm so grateful for it. Just hang with me because I want to hear from you all. Resilient fundraising on an organizational level requires us to set realistic revenue goals. And I'm going to say this, having been a frontline fundraiser, it boded very, very well with me as a fundraiser when I was involved in that dialogue given the fact that I had access and acute understanding of how donors were giving and what their affinity and capacity was, because I was the person qualifying them, not my finance person, my CFO, not even my CEO. Right? So if folks are in organizations kind of imputing goals to folks, I get that we, got to crunch numbers and we're running businesses at the end of the day, but invite your fundraising officers, your CDOs, your development director into that conversation and talk about the realistic nature of those goals and the tenability of those goals, right? What I'm seeing and working with organizations across the globe is that on average, fundraisers, development teams are turning 20 to 30 prospects annually with between a 10 to 30% of closing, right? Of those prospects. I'm seeing this trend higher. But in terms of a prospect pipeline, I know that folks have these, if you're in bigger organizations, you might have these larger pipelines. But in terms of new business development and identifying new prospects, I'm seeing strong traction with, this sounds like looks like a sweet spot to me, and I'm seeing high margins of returns and closing. But for some organizations, this is what it looks like. And being in small and medium-sized shops, larger shops, yeah, it might resemble more, right? But nonetheless, you want to make sure that you're setting tenable targets, right? And what I'm encouraging folks to do, right, when they are met with these lofty fundraising goals, right? Expectations to double revenue in a year or two, right? Is to build a strategy and tactics where we show incremental, consistent revenue upticks over time, which resembles more like 10 to 25% increases year over year. Not 75, not 50, unless folks know something that I don't or you don't in terms of a gift coming down the pipeline, or they've been doing some stewardship that you as a fundraiser may not be aware of. We want to make sure that we're looking at how to grow revenue incrementally, sustainably over time, right? And make sure that we're setting realistic goals. And one of the last things I want to say here is that resilient fundraising in this space and time and season requires some ingenuity and reimagination. Ingenuity and reimagination. There are some things that we have to consider if we're going to sustain the test of time. We must consider our strategic partner collaborations. I'll give you an example. If you are a soup kitchen, right? And well, no, let me give you another example. If you are a housing organization, right, and your public funding has been cut for case management, for supportive services only, this happened to somebody. Somebody's probably on here who's facing this. If you are in the continuum of care being funded by HUD or others for housing and your services budget has been cut, right? A strategic partner collaboration might be to lean into who in the community is funded to provide straight case management or straight peer support, right? Can they pick up your constituents, your consumers in your housing program? Right? Since you've lost a chunk of funding to provide that service, the service is still very much needed. It makes perfect sense to identify who are those strategic partners in the community that can complement my service offering as a housing partner, right? So that I can do what I do well, right? And share the wealth. And I would even go this far. If funding in your region is being cut and you're providing housing, this organization is providing case management or peer support. Another organization is providing meals provisioning. Then the three of you have conversations and determine how many mutual constituents you might have or how many people you can serve in your region. And you have a conversation with the largest funders in your community and say, this is what we're working with, and this is what we need, not want, need, in order to continue to meet the needs of X number of people in this community. Because sometimes on the funding side of the table, and I've heard this from funders, it's not easily discernible whose work is, it might look like folks are duplicating work. So sometimes we have to draw the line in the sand and say, oh, no, 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 funder, we're not duplicating services. We're strategically aligned. Organization A does this, B does this, C does this, and this is what we need in the way of funding to do what we do without overextending ourselves and overburdening our teams and burning folks out, right? Resilient fundraising, it may require, depending on who you are as an organization, for you to look at earned revenue strategies, right? If you're publishing data and research, how can you monetize that research, right? Who needs that research? Where can you publish and sell that research, right? If you are providing a certain service, right, that can be packaged and sold, right? Explore that, right? I remember working for a children's organization that had been providing culturally relevant training for Black teachers, right? I remember finding an opportunity, creating an opportunity, not finding an opportunity, creating an opportunity to partner with other organizations that were training teachers that didn't have a culturally relevant pedagogy and selling our pedagogy to them and creating a training opportunity where those other teaching organizations could take advantage of our training, but at a cost, right? I was able to monetize a program that had been operating for almost 30 years and find this new way to generate revenue for that program as an earned revenue strategy, right? The last thing that I want to say about this is it requires us to explore new angles where it makes sense. I'll give you an example. Working with an organization in Los Angeles that provides services to justice involved individuals. In the midst of the elections, there were efforts being made by this particular organization to help people in Los Angeles, in the greater Los Angeles area, regain their right to vote, right, or to register to vote. Despite some of their criminal history, they were eligible to vote, right? And there were efforts being made to educate these justice involved returning citizens about upcoming ballot initiatives on the that were going to that were up for vote during the local election, right? There was an opportunity there for that organization to monetize that work. They had not previously done that. That work that they were doing in educating their constituents about laws and policies and helping them to get registered to vote, that work, that public education and awareness or advocacy piece, that was a prime opportunity to procure and marshal some funding to fund work that was unfunded. We got to be novel, y'all, and use some ingenuity about what we're doing, right? So to recap, because I want to hear from you, we got about 7 minutes. Resilient fundraising on a personal level, simple, prioritizes the fundraiser, the team, the person, the people behind the machine. It centers self-care and wellness, right? It is an organizational, I'm jumping ahead. It centers self-care and wellness. It centers boundary setting so that we show up in our best light and our power. Thank me later. Resilient fundraising on an organizational level fortifies the organization's fundraising resilience. necessitates a culture of empathy, transparency. This is not normal business, y'all, and we miss a moment if we act as though it is. It prioritizes sustainability over scalability. Instead of serving a bunch of folks, the multitudes, like in the Bible, we anchoring in on the ones that we got, right? And we want to meet their needs as best possible, right? It prioritizes retention, sets realistic revenue goals, requires ingenuity and reimagination. I want to hear from y'all. Yvonne, do I need to back out of here?
Before you do that, put your contact information out, and
Happy to
we'll
do it.
yes,
Happy
and
to do it.
we'll leave it up while we ask the first question, and then we'll get our faces a little bigger. So the first one, I'm just making sure I'm upvoted. 10 people are curious about any tips on engaging funders who are historically focused on innovative or new programs versus sustaining current ones.
Yeah, I mean, or I would be very, very honest with them. Maybe that's not the right funder for you. If that is not the best move for you in this space and time, the only exception I would say that makes sense for is if you have a novel angle that you can pursue funding for. In the case of that reentry organization that I was just describing, they had been providing services in the way of advocacy, voter education, and public education and awareness. We galvanize an opportunity to fund it, right? Is there some element of your work that if we approach this from another angle, right, perhaps it could possibly be posited as a new program, right? But perhaps serving, some of the same folks. I'd be really, really cautious right now about allowing folks to push me over into that field of launching new programs unless they're committing to sponsoring those programs year over year. That's the question that I'd be having. If that looks and feels good to you and is attractive to you, then that is the question that I would have. Is this something that you can commit to and get behind for multiple years, 2 years, 3 years, and beyond, right? Know what the commitment is before the funding commitment is, or the possibility, the prospect of funding before committing, because I'm seeing folks go deeper and wider and having to retrench in the subsequent year because the funding was not sustained for those new programs and initiatives. I'd be very, very cautious.
Yeah, thank you. And I would just say also that's the one good thing maybe about this is that we can have some real conversations,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's not business as usual, so people should take the opportunity to say it's not business as usual, dot dot
Absolutely.
dot and have those conversations.
Absolutely.
Okay, the next question that's upvoted, innovative strategies, exclamation mark. Christy says, what does current research post-COVID tell us about what strategies are most effective and with what donor audiences?
I'm not sure. Try me one more time, Yvonne.
Okay, so post-COVID, what current research, so after COVID,
Yeah.
what strategies are working with what kinds of donor audiences? So what are the most effective strategies for different donor audiences, whether it's, I guess, individuals,
Yeah.
foundations? Yes. Mhm.
So what I'm finding, and it depends on who you are, because I want to be very frank and say that every strategy is not for every organization. Some
That's true.
organizations are having special events when that's not necessarily the best strategy for them. What I'm finding consistently across the board is institutional fundraising. Is one that it seems to be holding its weight. Obviously, having a strong and robust annual fund, we saw the data points, stewarding our donor base, making sure that we're stewarding and communicating how we are able to make an impact with the support that we're receiving from our donors, those individual donors. That's holding its weight. I would say, opportunities for earned revenue, and I know that that one could be a little bit tricky. I'm seeing that holding its weight as organizations are, going into their bag and looking at what they can do to generate more earned income. Sometimes it's about, looking at who you can sell services to. If you're providing after school programming or STEM programming, right? Or music education, for instance, like some of my co-conspirators are, and you're providing that in community, sometimes maybe selling those services to a school system, right? Or, to charter schools, maybe that's earned income, right? Fee for service, that's holding its weight. Um, Digital fundraising. We saw that post COVID, organizations that had taken time and invested to make sure that they were showing up strong in the digital, their website, their donation form was optimized. We saw encouraging results with that in terms of digital fundraising. So those were some of the strategies that I would say research shows are, holding their weight and where folks are hanging out at and seeing encouraging results.
And I would just add that we know that donor advised funds are very big right now, and
Absolutely.
that's huge. And we encourage folks to have their candid profiles filled out and get a seal because those donor advised funds are using those candid profiles. So if they don't know you already, but they know where they want to make an impact and with whom, they can find your organization, your candid profile. And if you don't know much about that, we can put a link in the chat about candid profiles.
And the
Okay.
other
Now,
thing is
mhm.
DAF Day. I know National Donor Advised Fund Day is what, June 16th. DAFs is really, really key. And I'm encouraging everybody on the line, to consider. I pick up the phone, I email the philanthropy advisors at the community foundation. I want them to know who I am. I know that sometimes it feels like we're talking in a vacuum and, there might not be a feedback loop because you might not hear from the wealth advisors for some of these DAFs. Just be deliberate about it because I've received some of my largest unsolicited gifts from DAFs just because I was deliberate and diligent about making sure the wealth advisors got that impact report and saw the kind of impact my organization had achieved in the course of a year, and a check followed at some point in time. I have a meeting with our largest community foundation in 2 weeks. Any tips? Make sure that you're showing them impact. If you have any strategic imperatives, like if you know that over the next 3 years, your organization is going to serve X number of people or make X kind of inroads, be able to speak beyond the moment, right? What is your impact going to look like over time? Somebody asks, how are you finding contact information for these fund managers? You know what? I go on the websites for the community foundations. When you are receiving gifts via, like Fidelity or Vanguard Charitable, your gift processors or your DevOps people, sometimes there's contact information appended to those checks that are coming in. That information should be making its way into your CRM system, right? And we want to treat those individuals, those fund managers, just like we treat donors and send them impact data and send them thank yous. It works, right? I've received checks that weren't even in our pipeline just as a result of being diligent.
Don't,
Um,
Kia, I'm going to the Q&A because that's what we
okay,
told them to do.
okay, okay. Let me.
And you can open yours too. So how do you set those realistic goals when your board and higher level individuals have already set unrealistic goals without your input?
That has happened to me many, many a times. And I've told you, I've always been the squeaky wheel. Being the squeaky wheel can be risky to some folks. It's never been a risk to me because I've just never been afraid to do it. I've never been scared to do it. I've been very, very honest. I would talk show them the receipts. Like Whitney Houston said, show me the receipts. In terms of it could I see you laughing, Eva. Don't do it.
That is a
Don't do
terrible
it.
example.
But show me the receipts. Show me the receipts. No, you show the receipts. You show where your
Mm,
pipeline, how your
that's right.
pipeline is trending, whether we're talking your donor engagement portfolio. You should have these if we're talking about individuals or if we're talking about institutions. You should be able to show what your pipeline is looking like and how it's trending, right? And have an idea of what revenue is shaping up, even if you've got to get with your accounting colleagues, right? And crunch some numbers. You know what's in that pipeline. You have giving history. These are tools, right? And I was not afraid to say, listen, this pipeline is showing X amount of money in revenue, right? So the expectation is that this is going to grow by this percent change in this amount of time. Is somebody prepared to help add some names to this portfolio? Right? I'm using Candid. I'm using Instrumental. I'm using Grant Station. I'm inside philanthropy. I'm outside. I'm everywhere. And here's what I've got. I'd be happy to lean in and hear and learn about some prospects, but I'm going to need a little bit of help in order to get here. And I'd like to flesh this strategy out with you all because I have concerns about the tenability of this.
I love that because it's a career, it's a job. It's the you know what I
It
mean? So you
is.
should be able to say, yeah, that's not gonna work. You
It
can't just
absolutely
magically
is.
make things up. Andrea, thank you for the numbers that show consistency among private donors during the last Trump administration. But what about the very real moves now to curtail private foundations through tax and other limitations that are being proposed to Congress this week?
Absolutely. So here's my go to for that it is the National Council of Nonprofits. I don't want to steal thunder or give folks any marching orders. That is a group that's been at the helm of this. The CEO, Miss Yentel, I want to say Diane Yentel, has been shepherding that effort. Follow that sister on LinkedIn. She's a dynamic sister. They have been giving us our marching orders in the nonprofit sector and philanthropy in terms of who to call, contact our congressmen, our congressional leaders. They've been giving us language to use in terms of, how to advocate for our organizations in the sector. I'm going to drop the name of the organization in the chat. It's the National Council for Nonprofits. I don't want to, I'm a big fan of be in your lane and let folks lead that are best versed to lead. That organization is doing the work. The organization CEO, I believe her name is Danielle Yento. She's very active on LinkedIn. I comment. They keep me in the know. There we go. Somebody just shared it. Instead of me trying to beat the bushes and do what they're doing, I'm following their lead. And I encourage you to do the same and keep with the work that you're doing. Keep calm and carry on, but plug into groups like the National Council on Nonprofits or even into your local Center for Nonprofits for specifics in your region on how to go about battling this because this hurts. I read and saw what was introduced and yeah, it poses some implications for the work.
Yeah. Thank you
Many.
so much. Helen Claire, how would you recommend explaining to foundations the importance of sustaining their grants and not implementing hiatuses in this time? I understand why a foundation would want to mandate a hiatus period normally to ensure the other grantees would get a chance. But in a moment when funding is so volatile, I think it's important that funders maintain their grants for sustainability. Any advice on how to explain this to foundations?
Be very, very honest, transparent, and vulnerable. Whatever compelling data points you have, share it, right? I'm having conversations with foundation presidents, grants program officers, directors of grants, and I'm showing them. I'm not just talking, right? Because we know that I'm very passionate about the work that I do. This isn't just about my emotions, there's real impact on the other end of these decisions that are being made. So I'm going to show you better than I can tell you, right? And then I'm going to ask you, can I count on you, right? Or would you consider my needs, or would you consider? I've even asked as of late, would foundations consider convening and hearing from nonprofits in their regions? I'm actually working with some groups in places like Florida and Detroit to convene philanthropies as part of my work leading the Croom Institute. I told you I'm a nonprofit founder. The Fundraising N Black initiative is a program of the Croom Institute. And through that initiative, we're convening philanthropy leaders and convening nonprofits that are proximate to the harm. And we're having salon conversations and talking about where we can meet in the middle to ensure that programming, that funding is on the table to sustain the work that's being done,
Mm.
especially in light of the federal funding disruptions. There were some disruptions, contrary to what some people believe. There were some disruptions. I know that there was, a moratorium on that, but there were some folks that suffered some disruptions and funding losses as a result of that. And it's real, and the philanthropies have to know the impacts of that.
Thank you. Could you please suggest fundraising strategies for capacity building organizations? Many funders focus more on service-oriented organizations and give a skip to capacity building organizations who are just as important. Thank you.
I agree. And the Chrome Institute, as I shared, is a capacity building organization. You know, I'm looking for funders that fund capacity building type of work, funders that are particularly concerned with organizational resilience and fiscal health and those sorts of things. I'm hanging out there as opposed to trying to beat a dead horse, right? I'm looking for those funders where there's that alignment. Now, in cases where the capacity building priority may not be so clear, like if it's a community foundation, and they don't necessarily explicitly state that they fund capacity building types of organizations. I have conversations with these program officers, with these, leaders in these philanthropies. I'm really good to ask for a 20-minute virtual coffee chat or a tea talk. If you and I email, because I'm into tea, I do a tea talk, right? And I'm having conversations with them and talking this through with them and providing them with an overview of the work that the Croom Institute through Fundraising N Black and social justice fundraisers is doing to support nonprofits in this moment and beyond. Sometimes it takes getting through to those individuals and showing them where their work falls. I hate to say that. Not everybody has lived in experience and subject matter experts. Sometimes we have to show people the value and impact of our work. And that necessitates having conversations with folks. If you can't get their contact information off of their website, keep an eye out for those events in your region where your philanthropy leaders are and show up. You know, if nonprofits are welcomed and encouraged, I show up and rub elbows and get contact information. And yeah, I follow up and have conversations with people about the needs of my organization.
Okay, I guess we'll try to get this one more in.
Sure, go
Any
for it.
tips for encouraging honesty and transparency between the development and finance departments? We are trying to move our grant making to center around best practices. Finance wants to budget for to increase deficits, while development is trying to establish funding stability and sustainability.
Yeah, there has never been a moment in my career where there wasn't a little bit of fisticuffs, as the old Southerners say, between the dev people and the finance people, and sometimes even the program people. I've been in all kinds of environments, y'all. Um, at the end of the day, you know, I believe in folks coming together and having a heart to heart and looking at the figures in front of us, right? Maybe Dev needs to talk more detailed about what's in your pipeline relative to what their expectations are or what they're looking to do. Because it's been my experience as a frontline fundraiser that a lot of these decisions are made in isolation, and not necessarily in conversation with the dev folks. And that is a big disconnect. And I'm not really sure how and why and why that happens, but it happens. The proof is in the pudding. I would invite a meeting and, provide some overview or some explanation, of where you are, what the value of everybody's portfolio is, what it boils down to in terms of dollars and cents. Some of these conversations require a lot of courage. I know that there are people inside of the organizations that might not necessarily be listening, that might just be kind of digging their heels in because that's what they've been allowed to do, right? And it is problematic. So I feel your pain, um, with that. But somebody's got to find the courage to say, listen, there's some dissonance here, and we've got to get to the root of this, or we're not going to get anywhere.
Thank you so much, Kia. We are
No,
totally
thank you
at
for
time,
having me.
but we appreciate you. And I hope people are listening
Oh
because
my
we've had
God.
several conversations, and honesty and being candid and being transparent are kind of the ways to go right now. And this moment is allowing that. So I hope people are really listening to that. And if you love this webinar, we hope you'll be back again. Thank you
Wait a
again,
minute, I
Kia.
gotta read Olivia's comment. She
Uh-oh,
said,
what'd she
I
say?
forever pledge my allegiance. Wait a minute. Wait a minute, it almost made me shed a tear. Takia
Oh.
forever. Oh, y'all sure know how to make a girl feel good.
Well,
I
I'll try to
pledge
send
my
you some of
allegiance to
these.
Kia Chrome forever. Best fundraising webinar I have ever seen. Yes.
We'll try to
Thank
get some of these
you.
to you, Kia.
Thank
Okay? Some
you.
of the comments, we'll try to send them to you. Thank you, everybody.
Have a good
We
one.
appreciate you. Bye, y'all.
Bye bye.